Welcome back to another Yu-Gi-Oh! Primer. Today we're going to be talking about one of the more fan-favorite archetypes, Cyber Dragon. Cyber Dragon typically is played as a going second deck, but there are cards like Infinity that allow the deck to go first. We'll be kind of going through a lot of the cards in the deck that see play, some that don't, going over what they do, why they're important, why they may or may not see play. Let's go ahead and start with the heart and soul of the deck, Cyber Dragon. So he's the namesake of the deck. Back in the GX era, one of the characters on the TV show had a deck basically built around Cyber Dragon. There were a lot of other Cyber cards, Cyber Valley, Cyber Altanin, a ton of cards that didn't really make it into the eventual Cyber Dragon archetype that they created and eventually started pumping out support for. But a lot of cards with typing advantageous to the deck, with effects that benefited the deck back in the day do exist, but just know that they don't see play and they're not important to know about. Mini cards specifically name Cyber Dragon either as a material, as a card it needs to resolve its effect, or as a means of having its name being treated as Cyber Dragon. So it's important to keep him in mind at all times when talking about the cards. We'll go ahead and talk about probably the strongest non-Cyber Dragon specific card in the deck, and that's Cyber Dragon Core. Cyber Dragon Core's name becomes Cyber Dragon while in the field or in the grave, and when it's normal summoned, you can add a Cyber Spell Trap from your deck to your hand. That effect is extremely powerful. This card basically you want to see in your opening hand pretty much every turn, so you can search one of the powerful Cyber spells that you play in your deck, or search the Cyber Trap, which does see some play. It also has an effect to banish itself if your opponent controls a monster, to special a Cyber Dragon monster from deck. Notice it says Cyber Dragon monster. It doesn't have to summon Cyber Dragon specifically. It can summon one of the other cards. This one's really good, sees tons of play, and will probably continue to always see play unless it gets power crept by another card. Next up is one of the later additions to the Cyber Dragon lineup in terms of the main deck monsters, and that's Naxter. This card has an effect where you can discard a card, specifically a monster, to special it from your hand. If it's normal or special summon, you can reborn a monster in your machine monster in your grave with 2100 attack or defense. Funnily enough, in a format where Orcust still had Mermaid, the Cyber Dragon Orcust variant could actually use this to reborn Dingirsu because it specifically says a machine with 2100 attack or defense. It doesn't specify an attribute. So this card's crazy. It represents a free body. It represents a reborn. It's really good. And it's a great machine dupe target, which we'll get to later. There's Cyber Dragon Hers. This card, the only effect that you're really ever going to resolve is the effect if it's sent from anywhere to the grave. You can add a Cyber Dragon from your deck to your hand or graveyard. Notably, it says Cyber Dragon specifically, so if you're adding from deck to hand, it has to be vanilla Cyber Dragon. But if you're adding from grave, it can be any of the main deck ones that treat themselves as Cyber Dragon while on the field or in the grave. This card's really strong because it represents a search and, again, great machine dupe target because it does treat itself as Cyber Dragon while on the field. So that is pretty strong. So before we get to the honorary Cyber Dragon, I figure I might as well cover a few of the cards that don't really see any play. These were in the, I believe, Cyber Strike structure deck. These all have effects. They're all kind of neat, but they don't see any play, so I'm not going to cover them here. If you want to read them and see if they're worth playing on your own time, that's up to you. But if you're playing against a competent Cyber Dragon opponent, then they're not going to be playing these. Next up, the Honorary Cyber Dragon, a level 5 light machine. Galaxy Soldier. Now, Galaxy Soldier is especially strong in this deck because it's a level 5. That means it can be used to make Nova. And the fact that it's a machine means that it can be used as material for some of the Cyber Dragon fusions. But what makes this card exceptionally strong is that it can discard a card from your hand to the grave and summon itself. And then when it's summoned, it searches a galaxy monster. Now, that summon is not once per turn, but the search is, meaning that you can discard a monster, summon the Galaxy Soldier, and search a second Galaxy Soldier. And in scenarios where you open Galaxy Soldier plus hers, Galaxy Soldier pitch hers searches both a Galaxy Soldier and a Cyber Dragon to pitch for the second Galaxy Soldier, meaning that this 2-card combo represents 2 free level 5 machines on field, which means you get access to your Nova and eventually your Infinity pretty much immediately. Some lists choose to cut this card if you're aiming to be more of a go second build, but I still think that this card is worth at least considering, even if you're building a more strict go second build. And if you're building this deck to go first, this card is a must at 2 or 3, depending on how down bad you are. Before we get into the cyber spells, I might as well mention Machine Duplication since I already brought it up earlier. Machine Duplication lets you target a machine with 500 or less attack and then summon 2 monsters from deck with the same name as that face-up monster. The reason why this card's so strong in this deck is because you have multiple targets which all treat themselves as Cyber Dragon while on the field and have less than 500 attack, meaning that any of these 3 plus Machine Dupe means you can normal summon one of these or special summon in the case of Naxter, target it with Machine Dupe, and then summon 2 vanilla Cyber Dragons from deck. Meaning, again, this 2-card combo, any one of these 3 plus Machine Dupe is instant access to Nova and then eventual access to Infinity. So this card's really strong. And in scenarios where you already have access to Nova or you don't necessarily need Nova, it can also represent access to things like Seeger or other Link monsters, or access to some of the fusions. Now let's go ahead and get the ball rolling on talking about the cyber spells. Let's start by talking about the non-cyber spells, the ones that don't see play. And that is Overload Fusion and Power Bond. I believe there is a variant of this deck that plays Overload Fusion because it is searchable by one of the new Cyber Dark cards. But if you're playing a pure Cyber Dragon deck, neither of these cards are really worth playing because they're completely unsearchable and they're extremely contingent on drawing other pieces. Machine Duplication has the exact same problem where it is unsearchable in this deck and is only good in conjunction with other certain cards. But assuming you're maxing out on those other cards that go with Machine Duplication, all you need is Machine Dupe plus one other 9 of. But Machine Dupe is definitely more worth playing because both of these require not only for you to draw them in conjunction with other cards, but Power Bond requires you to have materials either in hand or on field, meaning it's a huge minus. And Overload Fusion requires graveyard setup. This card is really good in a scenario where you go first and think you're going to be going into a turn 3 or 5, where you have setup engraved, you have the materials engraved to go into something from the extra deck, but you don't really want to be playing the game under the assumption that you're not going to be able to just kill your opponent on the crackback anyway. So on to the cards that actually see play. Let's start with Cyber Emergency. Cyber Emergency is an interesting card because it allows you to add a light machine that can't be normal summoned or set, or a Cyber Dragon monster from your deck to your hand. And it has a clause where if it's negated, you can discard a card and then add the card back to your hand. That's a weird one. I have never really seen that go off, but the effect to search drastically increases your consistency because this card suddenly turns machine duplication way more on in way more scenarios, because it makes it go from being 1 plus a 9 of to 1 plus a 12 of if you're playing Cyber Emergency at full copies as well. This card's extremely strong and extremely flexible. It allows you to play other light machines that can't be normal summoned or set as search targets for this. I can't really think of any that you would play off the top of my head, but there are scenarios where this card is just extremely flexible, because again, it can search any Cyber Dragon monster. Odds are you're searching core if you don't have access to it, and if you're looking at the line that I talked about with Galaxy Soldier, this can also represent access to hers, which means all you need is Galaxy Soldier plus a 6 of in order to get the 2-card combo to get access to Nova and Infinity on your first turn. Extremely powerful card. Extremely, extremely powerful. Next up is Cyber Repair Plant. This one requires you to have a Cyber Dragon in the grave, which is a little bit more setup than Emergency, but it has a more flexible search because it allows you to search a light machine regardless of whether it can be normal summoned or set. So this can search Galaxy Soldier, or it can search the Kaiju that's a light machine, which means that this deck can play searchable Kaijus as well. And this, assuming you have Grave set up, again, it turns the Galaxy Soldier combo into a 3 of plus a 9 of, and it turns the machine duplication into a 3 of plus a 15 of. So this deck has extremely consistent access to a lot of the power plays, even though they require extremely specific 2-card combos. Those 2-card combos can be 1 card plus any number of other cards. So things like the Galaxy Soldier line and the Machine Dupe line actually are pretty consistent considering the amount of search power in this deck. It also has an effect to shuffle a light machine back, but you're probably not going to be doing that. The last of the extremely playable cyber spells is Cyber Rev System. This one is a little iffy. It's basically either Ancient Rules or Monster Reborn, depending on what you need in that instance. It does give the card protection from card effects, but the problem is that that's not really good enough. But this card is strong enough that it does see play because of the fact that Cyber Dragon really wants the ceiling of summons raised because it has a lot of extremely powerful things it can go into. This card basically makes it a lot easier to do double Infinity on your first turn. And this can also be a huge blowout in scenarios where your opponent tries to clear your board. You can reborn a Cyber Dragon, and in some cases, that's enough to just win you the game. So this card's definitely really good. I could see scenarios where you would start cutting copies of this card, but it's just so strong in the context of this deck. I don't think you would ever actually want to do that. Last up is Cyber Load Fusion for the cyber spells. Cyber Load Fusion is searchable off of core, so I would play it personally as like a 1 of, and it allows you to shuffle back Cyber Dragon monsters, which can help turn back on things like machine duplication, allowing for future copies to be online. And it gives you access to your extremely powerful fusions that aren't contact fusions. So I would consider playing this. This was played pretty heavily in the versions of the deck that had access to Verte Anaconda, but because Verte's banned, you're not going to see this card nearly as much. And last up is Cybernetic Overflow. This card single-handedly raises the ceiling on how good go first versions of the deck can be, because searching this card as an interruption is extremely powerful, and because it's a trap card, it's immune to some of the negations that people might put up. Like Appaloosa can't negate it. Things like Utopic Draco can't negate it. So it's an extremely powerful card. and it raises the ceiling on the number of interruptions you can end on turn 1. Next up, let's just address the elephant in the room. I've mentioned them multiple times. They were here at the beginning. The trifecta has returned. Let's go ahead and talk about the Xyz in this deck. Starting with Cyber Dragon Nova. Cyber Dragon Nova basically has 2 effects. The first is that you can detach a material to special summon a Cyber Dragon from your grave. And it can also banish a Cyber Dragon from your hand or face-up monster card zone and gain 2100 attack. But the second relevant effect is that if it's destroyed by an opponent, or if it's just sent to the grave by an opponent, the second relevant effect is that if it's sent to the grave by your opponent, you can special a machine type fusion from your extra deck. This card was played as a target for Maximus, the Dogmatica card, that forced both players to send cards from their extra deck to the grave. If they Maximus you and you send a Nova, you can summon a fusion for free. The one that people tended to go for was Invoked Mechaba. The reason for that is because Mechaba is a negate. But in this deck, you can actually get access to some of your powerful fusions. I still think the Mechaba line is worth playing if you think Dogmatica is going to be a prevalent force in the meta. But if you don't expect to be Maximus very many times, then you probably shouldn't be playing targets for it, because that kind of clogs up spots in your extra deck. Now, Infinity is extremely powerful. It has 2 relevant effects. The first is that it can target a attack position monster and attach it as material, basically being a better Relinquished. But it's worse in the sense that it has to be an attack position monster. The second effect is that anytime your opponent activates an effect, you can just attach a material and negate it. Easy as that. And the fact that its first effect to attach a monster fuels the second negate effect means that doing things like Naxter reviving an Infinity can actually make it where the Infinity is extremely easy to turn on, especially if you summon the Naxter and attack. You can just slurp up the Naxter and suddenly you have a free negate. Next, let's talk about the reason why Cyber Dragon is such a scary deck to play against. First off, being Chimeratech Fortress Dragon. Chimeratech Fortress Dragon is basically a contact fusion where you can fuse Cyber Dragon and any number of machine monsters to summon it. And it gains 1000 attack for each material used for its special summon. But the thing that makes Fortress Dragon so strong is that you can contact fuse with machines on either side of the field, meaning that special summoning a Cyber Dragon into a big board of machines basically means that that entire board just gets sent to the grave as fusion material for a Fortress Dragon. And Mega Fleet is basically the same thing, in the sense that it also lets you contact fuse with monsters from either side of the field, but Mega Fleet specifically requires cards in the extra monster zone. This is both better and worse, because it's worse in the sense that you have less options in terms of how many monsters you can fuse with, but it's better in the sense that the monster doesn't have to be a machine. So if your opponent plays a Link deck and puts one of its boss monsters in the extra monster zone, special summoning Cyber Dragon suddenly threatens that monster. And in a lot of cases, that's enough to really make people sweat. And last up, let's talk about Seeker. Cyber Dragon Seeker is the Link monster that was printed for the archetype. It requires 2 machines, including a Cyber Dragon. Its name becomes Cyber Dragon while on the field or in the grave. And during the battle phase, if it is not declared an attack, you can target 1 machine monster you control with 2000 or more attack. For the rest of this turn, it gains 2100 attack. Also, neither player takes any battle damage from attacks involving that monster. Basically, it takes a monster you control that has the Cyber Dragon attack, and adds the Cyber Dragon attack onto it. So you can target a Cyber Dragon, its attack essentially becomes double. You can target an Infinity. Basically, this effect allows you to topple over any monster that might be a problem. The issue with it is that you don't deal damage during that battle phase, and Cyber Dragon is known for being able to OTK. So if you're in that situation, then you're probably pretty desperate for ways to out a certain monster, and that's not a good place to be. But having access to Seeger means that you don't have to worry about it nearly as much as you would otherwise. And that's Cyber Dragon. I hope that you learned something, and I hope that this video gave you a good idea of what it's like to play as a Cyber Dragon player and against a Cyber Dragon player. If I missed anything, feel free to let me know in the comments. Let me know what your favorite Cyber Dragon monster is. Leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. So, Machine Dupe is definitely more worth playing than these two because both of these